Breaking news this evening, former President Jimmy Carter has passed away at the age of 100.
He became the first president ever to reach that age on October 1st. His wife of 77 years, former First Lady Rosalynn Carter, died in November 2023 at 96. The 39th president was born in Georgia, served in the Navy, the Georgia State Senate, and as the Peach State's governor. He was elected president in 1976 after defeating incumbent Republican Gerald Ford. Carter's term was marred by domestic and foreign issues. He faced several economic challenges, including rising inflation and gas shortages. He also struggled with problems overseas, most notably the Iran hostage crisis. Carter lost his 1980 bid for re-election to Republican Ronald Reagan, and after leaving the White House, Carter devoted his retirement to humanitarian efforts. He founded the Carter Presidential Center to promote human rights across the globe and won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002. He also worked extensively with Habitat for Humanity, volunteering to build houses well into his 90s. In February 2023, the Carter Center announced that he was getting hospice care at his home in Plains, Georgia. Special Report anchor Brett Baer takes a deeper look back at Jimmy Carter's life, presidency, and legacy.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
After the political trauma of Watergate, Jimmy Carter's squeaky clean Baptist background appealed to many Americans. As if to demonstrate there was a new way of doing things in Washington, he began his presidency on a frigid January day in 1977, walking instead of riding the length of Pennsylvania Avenue from the Capitol to the White House, the first president ever to do this. Born in Plains, Georgia in 1924 to peanut farming parents, Carter attended the Naval Academy, earning the rank of lieutenant. In 1946, he married Rosalynn Smith and returned to Plains in 1953 to run the family farming business. It was there that Carter developed an interest in politics. He was elected state senator in 1962 and governor of Georgia in 1970.
I am a candidate for president.
When he announced plans to run for president in 1974, Carter was largely an unknown, but he managed to win his party's nomination and edge out incumbent President Gerald Ford by just 2% of the popular vote, one of the closest margins in recent history. President Carter's greatest triumph came in 1978, when he brokered marathon diplomatic talks between Israel's Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat of Egypt. The resulting Camp David Accords ended years of fighting between the two countries.
We've got to stop crying and start sweating. Stop talking and start walking. Stop cursing and start praying.
The late 70s were a time of oil shortages, high unemployment, and double-digit inflation. Carter worked diligently to solve these problems, but the economy slipped into a recession. Then an event that would dominate the remainder of Carter's presidency. Iranian militants captured and held 52 American embassy employees hostage in Tehran. Unable to negotiate their release, Carter ordered a rescue mission, which ended in disaster. 8 American servicemen died when their helicopters collided in the Iranian desert.
Americans in Iran were mistreated.
In 1980, voters rejected Carter's bid for a second term. And to add insult to injury, on the day he left office, the American hostages in Tehran were released to the new Reagan administration. Carter returned to Georgia and through his nonprofit Carter Center remained active in efforts to promote peace around the world. His efforts were successful, and he garnered more respect after he left office than while he was in it, despite countless controversial statements in recent years, including calls for the U.S. to legitimize the terror group Hamas, which is openly committed to the destruction of Israel. He helped convince Haitian military dictator Raúl Cedras to relinquish control of the island nation to elected leader Jean-Bertrand Aristide. He monitored elections in Nicaragua and helped end a standoff over inspection of nuclear facilities between the U.S. and North Korea. Carter was often seen with hammer in hand, building homes for the poor as part of his continuing support for the Habitat for Humanity project. He wrote countless books, including one book of poetry and a memoir. In May 2002, Carter took his first but not last trip to Cuba, the first American president to visit in more than 40 years. He called for the U.S. to end its trade embargo while challenging Fidel Castro to institute democratic reforms. Later that year, the former president won the Nobel Peace Prize for, quote, his decades of untiring effort to find peaceful solutions to international conflicts. During a trip to the Middle East in the summer of 2009, an alleged assassination plot by an al-Qaeda-linked group was uncovered, though the president's aides said they had no knowledge of the plot against him. In the summer of 2010, Carter traveled to North Korea, successfully securing the release of an American citizen who had been sentenced to 8 years of hard labor after allegedly entering the country illegally. Upon his return, Carter advocated the need for a comprehensive peace treaty with the isolated country, arguing Pyongyang was ready to talk and that the U.S. should come to the table. Carter didn't hesitate to criticize the only other living president to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, denouncing President Obama for carrying out widespread drone strikes and warrantless wiretapping. He also said the Obama administration waited too long to respond to the rising threat of ISIS. Just months later, Carter announced he had melanoma that had spread to his liver and brain, tackling the diagnosis with a measure of faith and fortitude. Through his cancer treatment, the former president remained active, continuing his charitable and religious activities.
I don't know what the results will be, but I'm ready for whatever comes.
Months later, he was declared cancer-free. He continued to hammer away at his charitable work with Habitat for Humanity all the way into his 90s.
I feel like we always get more out of it than we put into it, although we work sometimes very hard and overwork on occasion.
And in one of his last major public appearances, made a show of bipartisanship, joining 4 other living presidents at the funeral service of George H.W. Bush in 2018. Second chances. James Earl Carter thrived on them.
I've had a wonderful life. I've had thousands of friends, and I've had an exciting and adventurous and gratifying existence.
And over time, Americans developed a renewed appreciation for a man who resoundingly lost a re-election bid. This gentleman farmer from Plains, Georgia, who rose to become the 39th president of the United States. In Washington, Brett Baer, Fox News.
In Fox News contributor Karl Rove, and Karl, you look at this life, started in politically 1976, came out of nowhere, won the election that year, lost re-election resoundingly in 1980. You think that maybe that's perhaps it for public service and a life in public, but he had a pretty incredible run after that. Really a remarkable American life.
Absolutely. Only 45 men have been the president of the United States. He was the 39th president and the 38th American to occupy the office. And while he had, as Brett pointed out in his report, ups and downs as president, it was the life of compassion and service that he led after he left office in 1981 that really marks the life of this remarkable person.
You talk a little bit about that life. He was someone who gave Bible study at Maranatha Baptist Church in Plains, Georgia. When I was a local reporter in Savannah nearly 20 years ago, I took the ride out a little bit west to Plains, Georgia, and attended one of the services and attended the Bible study. And then there he was, the former president of the United States, waiting for people to take photos with him. That's a pretty Jimmy Carter story, isn't it?
It really is. I met him as a young man in my early 20s, walking through the Washington National Airport in 1975, and there was Carter carrying his a bag over his shoulder with his suit in it, and I introduced myself as a young staffer at the Republican National Committee, and he was the governor of Georgia and running for president. He gave me his business card and told me to keep an open mind. Now, I wish I'd held on to that business card, but there was no pretense about the man. Think about what he did as president. As president, Brett pointed out the Camp David Accords that ended the struggle between Israel and Egypt that had dominated the Middle East for decades, the animosity, anger, and often war. He also did a great thing for our country by sparking a era of deregulation. We had heavy government involvement in the railroads and in airlines and telecommunications, And though he was a Democrat, he sort of did not like the idea of the government trying to run and dictate so much. And this sparked an economic, an economic revival of these industries that has helped the country for decades. And he also reinstituted in our foreign policy a reverence and respect for human rights that helped bring down the Soviet Union. He began to herald the dissidents in the Soviet Empire and to stand up for human rights. And this was an extraordinary moment that was echoed by his predecessors, both Republican and Democrat, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, all of whom continued the emphasis on human rights. He had his difficulties: double-digit inflation, double-digit interest rates, double-digit unemployment that marked his years in office, and was a big reason why Ronald Reagan rose to power in the 1980 election, because of the poor economy. And as Brett pointed out, he was in essence the central figure in the Iran-Contra crisis. After the United States began to appear weak, our adversaries around the world were on the move. The Russians in Afghanistan and Muslim extremists in Iran, who overthrew a staunch U.S. ally, the Shah. But it really, when you step back and look at the man, you have to look at all that he did to restore confidence after Watergate, a belief that the presidency of the United States could be occupied by a man of high moral standards, and then the life he led after he left office.
All right, well, Karl Rove, thank you so much for joining us this evening and your perspective. Very much appreciated. Molly?
Rich, we go now to Michigan. Michigan GOP Congressman and incoming House Education Committee Chair Tim Walberg. Sir, thank you for joining us on this remarkable evening as we remember the life of former President Jimmy Carter. I want to get your early reflections on this long, broad life, a man of service, a man of faith, and of course 4 years in the presidency. Your thoughts?
Well, it's good to be with you. And yes, this is a momentous occasion. I think we've looked toward it for some time now, but when it actually happens, you realize that while you may disagree with a person politically or in policy, yet you respect the fact that he was willing to step up. He was willing to make decisions and move forward. And he had some real successes, as was just mentioned in your prior interview. The last time, and really the only time I had a chance to just briefly talk with him, I believe it was at the funeral of John Dingell, the man of the house from Michigan. And of course, Jimmy Carter beat President Ford, who was also a great Michigan person as well. So that intertwines. But you have to say about Jimmy Carter that he lived out what he believed. He did the best that he could. And the most important thing, he never stopped. He continued right on to the end.
You may have a few intertwining things with Jimmy Carter beyond just a brief meeting. There's faith, of course. You're a man of faith as well. And also education. This was something that Jimmy Carter was very passionate about, having grown up in in the South at a time when education was not available to every African American. He fought very hard to expand education. So just your thoughts on his journey, his faith journey. He was openly an evangelist and also someone passionate about education.
Yeah, I've often said that I'm a Christian first, a conservative second, and a Republican third. And probably Jimmy Carter would have said something very similar as well. Though we differed on certain, I believe, key principles of faith relative, for instance, to life and the life issue of abortion, yet I think in many things we still believe much. He was right to the end a teacher, a Sunday school teacher. He believed the Bible was something that should be taught and people could put their lives toward that. We know there are disagreements as we study the Bible because of human understanding, but nonetheless, that was specific. In the area of education, Rosalind continued to push forward in that area, believing that the future as well as the present of our country revolved around having good education. And so I'm delighted now to be chairman of the Education Committee in the House, looking forward to promoting education, not simply for the students, but for the teachers as well, to allow them to do what they desire to do, what they've been trained to do, what many of them say they need, that kid fix of a student in front of them, and then students who will be taught the basics that they need to function, to learn in society, and then build upon that for the future.
Thank you. Congressman Tim Walberg, thank you for your thoughts as we're looking back in the life of former President Jimmy Carter. Rich?
Molly, we're now going to go to Martin Luther King III. He's a human rights activist. And, you know, Mr. King, if you think of two names to come out of the state of Georgia, Carter and King are right up there. What did President Carter mean for human rights? What did he mean for civil rights?
Well, President Carter was clearly a leader in our nation and world as it relates to human rights as well as civil rights. I first must send my condolences to his whole entire family. We are praying for his family. But also, President Carter was a very close friend of my mom's as well as my father. When he was in office, he did attempt to get the King holiday passed, and of course it did not pass then, but it was passed, of course, under the leadership of President Reagan in 1983. And so when I think about President Carter, and I hope that the world is looking at him as one of the greatest human, I would say, first of all, moral and spiritual and human rights leaders of all time. After office, building houses all over our nation. Also, when you look at democracy, going to over 100 countries to observe elections and further democracy. He is certainly the example for our whole nation and much of the world, for one who continues their service after serving for 4 years as the President of the United States of America.
What do you think it means to service, to have the former President of the United States swinging a hammer and helping build shelter for people?
Well, I hope it sets an example that, you know, my father, it is often said, not just my dad, but it has been said that he who is greatest among you shall be your servant. And when you use your hands and build something from nothing, from scratch, and really a home for really the least of these, I mean, he is personifying the life that he lived. He didn't just say something. Many of us talk and say things, but he talked and said things, and he then did them. And that's what I think it represents. The fact that he would physically, he and his wife, would physically get teams of people and work with Habitat for Humanity to provide housing for people.
And what about the faith community?
And she was too.
I mean, you go to the Carter Library, and at the time, years ago, you know, there'd be dates posted on the door there saying, hey, come catch President Carter at Maranatha Baptist Church and listen to a sermon. I can't imagine too many former presidents had the time to do that many dates when they're traveling around the world. I mean, he really did put faith first and foremost, like a few other presidents have.
That is so true, indicative of exactly who he was. If you look up a definition of morality, of spirituality, of character in the dictionary, you'll probably find a picture of President Carter.
And you know, just beyond that, the legacy in the state of Georgia, what did his coming back home and staying in Georgia mean for the state?
Well, first of all, even though I doubt that he was here very many days, he was here, of course, and certainly for the last several years. But he was all the time that I can think of all over the world. I remember stories, and I was on a plane once or twice. President Carter, whenever he entered an airline, wherever he was traveling, he would go through the entire airplane and shake everyone's hand. This was every flight that he got on.
Yeah.
And so, you know, when you think about that, that's just remarkable that he would do that. Before the plane left, people didn't know him, and they knew he had been president. But to physically be able to say, you know what, I got to shake President Carter's hand.
Absolutely remarkable.
That's just amazing.
Martin Luther King III, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon to talk about President Carter. Very much appreciated.
Thank you.
We'll be back.
Liberty Mutual customers
less than $5 a day.
Go to church.
Since
Take time for the
dog, Bogart has lost
prayer.
so much weight.
The Lord
so
giveth,
much more energy.
and the Lord taketh.
It's like a puppy again.
Love your life and what you've been given. It is not accidental. Search for your purpose and do it as best as you can.
Makes it really easy
Forgive,
to keep him lean
it frees the soul.
now.
Recognize the special people you've been blessed to know. Live for today. Enjoy the moment.
remembering the 39th President of the United
Jimmy
States,
Carter,
Jimmy
friend.
Carter. For a look back at his life and legacy,
Signed in my
stay with
Bible,
Fox News Channel.
took my pictures with him, and loved him dearly. And Pat Crowley, reporter, Cincinnati Enquirer,
because you could do anything.
and many other newspapers.
What if
Wonderful
all the things
gentleman,
that get in your way were gone?
friend,
So
and a
then
great
what you left
reporter
was possibility.
and family man.
Reaction is pouring in from President Biden and other elected officials on the death of former President Jimmy Carter. We have Lucas Tomlinson joining us now. He is in St. Croix in the U.S. Virgin Islands. That is where President Biden has been spending the holidays. Lucas, to you.
Well, Molly, we're still waiting to see if President Biden will be making remarks this evening. In the meantime, we just received a statement from his Vice President, Kamala Harris. I will read it. It says, quote, President Jimmy Carter was guided by a deep and abiding faith in God, in America, and in humanity. Jimmy Carter's life is a testament to the power of service. As a lieutenant in the United States Navy, the 76th governor of Georgia, and the 39th president of the United States. He reminded our nation and the world that there is strength in decency and compassion. As president, he protected our air and water, promoted transparency in government, and brokered an historic peace treaty between Egypt and Israel at Camp David. Throughout his life, President Carter was strengthened by the love and support
Eula
of his
Bingham
mother,
there in the picture.
77 years,
Bless her
First
heart.
Lady Rosalind
Is director of
Carter, whose
OSHA
life President
and
Biden
my
I
cousin,
had the opportunity to
Eula
celebrate
Bingham
in
from
Georgia last
Ohio
year.
and
After
Grant
leaving
County,
office, President Carter
Kentucky.
continued his fight for peace, democracy, and human dignity through the Carter Center. I had the privilege of knowing President Carter for years. I will always remember his kindness, wisdom, and profound grace. His life and legacy continue to inspire me and will inspire generations to come. Our world is a better place because of President Carter. Doug and I send our love and prayers to the Carter family. Now, earlier we also heard from President-elect Trump. I will read that as well, Molly. It says, I just heard the news about the passing of President Jimmy Carter. Those of us who have been fortunate to have served as president understand this is a very exclusive club, and only we can relate to the enormous responsibility of leading the greatest nation in history. The challenges Jimmy faced as president came at a pivotal time for our country, and he did everything in his power to improve the lives of all Americans. For that, we all owe him a debt of gratitude. Malani and I are thinking warmly of the Carter family and their loved ones during this difficult time. We urge everyone to keep them in their hearts and prayers. Now, Molly, with the Panama Canal back in the news, it is worth reminding our viewers that it was President Carter helped usher in this treaty to give that canal back. Of course, the Panama Canal dates back to a treaty in 1903. President Theodore Roosevelt helped build the Panama Canal. In fact, he helped create the country of Panama. That area used to be part of Colombia. And in 1903, there was a treaty that said the United States was going to own that canal, and it did for many years. But it's notable that in 1964, there were riots, and 4 American service members were killed, and there was concern that the United States should not keep holding on to that canal. In fact, when President Carter at the time read David McCullough's book about the Panama Canal, he felt a belief that that canal should be returned, and that, you know, it wasn't the most popular decision. However, it's notable not a majority of Americans did not say they wanted to give back to the canal. In fact, the public is split. But Carter went to Congress. He spoke to the senators. There were a number of senators, including a very conservative senator by the name of Barry Goldwater, who he got to come over to his side. He even convinced the editor of the National Review, Bill Buckley, that this canal should be returned. So it was certainly an issue on the campaign trail in 1980 with Ronald Reagan, who, in fact, he debated Bill Buckley on his show, The Firing Line. Reagan wanted to return it, but Buckley wanted to hold on to it. But it's notable that it wasn't even just Barry Goldwater. He also, Jimmy Carter recruited John Wayne, whose first wife was Panamanian by birth. So Carter is one of, for his supporters say that's one of his accomplishments was giving the canal back. Of course, it's back in the news because of what President-elect Trump has said he wants to see happen with the canal. But it's just notable, but just part of the history there. But certainly, when you look at his presidency, while many see failures, there certainly was some successes in there. We heard from Brett's obituary of President Carter, the Camp David Accords, first time an Arab nation, Egypt, had ever recognized the state of Israel. It brought peace for a time in the Middle East, but of course, His time was overshadowed during that 444 days when the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and the Americans inside that embassy, 52 to be exact, were taken hostage in Iran. And of course, the problem of Islamic fundamentalism has not been solved today, and today a theocracy still exists in Iran, Mike.
Credited with warming diplomatic relations with China, still challenges there as well. You know, so many of these global issues continue all throughout history as this great American story goes on. Lucas Tomlinson from St. Croix, as we wait further word from potentially from President Biden on the passing of former President Jimmy Carter. Lucas, thank you. Rich?
Well, Molly, speaking of the Camp David Accords, President al-Sisi of Egypt has a statement saying that Carter's significant role in achieving the peace agreement between Egypt and Israel will remain etched in the annals of history. We will now turn to Justice to correspondent David Spunt, who has met President Carter a number of times, interviewed him, corresponded with him. So, David, what was it like speaking with the president?
Well, Rich, he was very down to earth, and thanks for having me on. I know I spoke to you in the last hour and a half or so. He never forgot where he came from, Plains, Georgia. This is someone that could have gone anywhere after he became president of the United States, leader of the free world, most powerful man in the world, and he decided he wanted to come back to Plains, Georgia. In fact, after the Naval Academy, he was the only president ever to go to the Naval Academy and graduate from the Naval Academy, and he chose to come back to Plains, Georgia. I got to know Jimmy Carter because I was a reporter in Columbus, Georgia. That was my first job almost 20 years ago, and Plains is in the Columbus DMA, the viewing market of Columbus. Jimmy Carter used to call in my station on Friday nights and speak and ask for the sports director and ask about baseball games or football games and call in some of the scores. So they would get, you know, fascinated by the fact that Jimmy Carter would literally pick up the phone and call in, and just like a regular guy on the phone. So it's something to say that Jimmy Carter never forgot where he came from. I first met him in 2007 at a baseball game in Plains, Georgia, on an old baseball diamond behind the Plains High School, where he went to high school, which is now the Jimmy Carter National Historic Site. And over time, I went to his church, and you know, many times, probably close to 10 times, where he taught Sunday school, and finally he agreed to sit down and do an interview with me a couple of years later before I left that market to go to my next market. And he gave me about an hour of his time. And as a young kid in his early 20s, I always appreciated that, and I never forgot that.
And you know, David, we have a little less than a minute here, but he remained in touch with him. You continued to correspond with him, right?
I did. I wrote letters with him. He signed a letter for my daughter, who was born 6 years ago, signed a book for her, I should say, and was always good about keeping in touch and pictures and whatnot. And then my wife met him for his 91st birthday. We were back in Plains, and she had an opportunity to meet him as well. And really just a gentleman, all-around gentleman who never forgot where he came from.
Yeah. Well, David Spunt, our Justice correspondent, thank you so much for your perspective.
So true.
In speaking with
both of
President
them.
Carter, who was very accessible, if you knew
Loved
where to find
them
him.
dearly.
So, David, thank you very much, and we're going to take a quick
I love their lives.
Thank you.
Working for Jesus. Peekaboo and I are enjoying the stories about Jimmy Carter. I can remember being second in line in his campaign, with Dale Sykes at top and myself second, and campaigning for Jimmy Carter for president, and worked my head off after graduating from UK in 1970 and teaching the very first Black History course in a public school in Jessamine County, and then later at Erlanger Lloyd High School, where I was elected president of the Education Association in Erlanger and Elsmer school system. Wonderful memories. Jimmy Carter and his race, which he won, and my cousin, Eula Bingham, from the Bingham family in Grant County, became the director of OSHA. She was one of his key persons and number one key persons in Ohio campaigning for him. A wonderful lady. And the first director of OSHA in America. The first director for OSHA, fighting for safety for workers of the world and the country. God bless her. She's buried in Highland Cemetery now. And June and I have our grave sites in Highland Cemetery in Fort Mitchell, Kentucky. God bless both of them.
You'll help us
And God
continue
bless
the life-saving
the memories of
research
Jimmy Carter and Rosalind Carter, and my good friend also Pat Crowley, who just passed away at the age of 63. Think of that. Jimmy Carter lived to be 100. Pat's taken home to heaven at the age of 63. Pat Crowley left his mark on all of the Commonwealth of Kentucky and the state of Ohio. With a wonderful job he did as a reporter and as a gentleman with people and human beings, a person of love. Be with his wife Pam and their family and grandchildren in your prayers, as well as the Carter family in your prayers. I hope you enjoy the video I tried to put together here for you to see some of the memories of Jimmy Carter, who signed in my Bible along with many other people. And I always got kidded a little bit about asking dignitaries for their signature in the Bible when I was elected Superintendent of Education for the state of Kentucky, and before that when I was Commissioner of Motor Vehicles and Deputy Secretary of Transportation for Kentucky, and worked for Congressman Breckinridge in the 70s for many years. So God bless you all, and I hope you enjoy the program we put together for you today. And a little peekaboo, and Josie's around here somewhere. But she's hiding. Mommy's gone to the grocery store.
What if you could tackle your dog's itching,
Love you all.
and low energy?
And as soon as I find out the particulars on Pat Crowley's funeral services, I'll try to put it on my Facebook and YouTube channel, Travels with Dr. John Stephenson, or Facebook under just John Stephenson, STEPHENSON. Or if you have questions, give me a call at 859-750-0000. Again, that's 859-750-0000. God bless you and have a great day.
Your car steering wheel could be, if you've been in a crash involving a deployed airbag, please contact us today.
We are remembering the life of former President Jimmy Carter as we go on this evening, and we've been receiving remembrances from all across the world, but here is one from King Charles. He says, "It was with great sadness that I learned of the death of former President Carter. He was a committed public servant and devoted his life to promoting peace and human rights. His dedication and humility served as an inspiration to many, and I remember with great fondness his visit to the United Kingdom in 1977. My thoughts and prayers are with President Carter's family and the American people at this time." That visit in 1977, very early in his presidency, ahead of a NATO visit. Now we're going to bring in Kyron Skinner, Fox News contributor, to talk about this remarkable and long life of former President Jimmy Carter. Kyron, your thoughts tonight as we're just beginning these remembrances.
You know, there's some important ways to think about the presidency of Jimmy Carter. He is the one that represents the divide between the post-Cold War world and the 21st century, where the United States faced radical Islam after 9/11. He actually addressed radical Islam, we didn't use that term yet, as president with the Iranian hostage crisis, with the Iranian Revolution. And at the same time, he was addressing what any world leader would have seen as more than enough great power competition with China and Russia. He normalized relations with China while engaging in nuclear negotiations with the Soviets and trying to hold them at bay. That would have been enough. But this gathering storm in the Middle East was also on his portfolio. And what made him so significant as a president in the late 1970s is that although we had the infrastructure in place for addressing the Soviet competition and the Chinese, we did not on the side of the Middle East. We didn't even have a Middle East command. We now call it Central Command. It didn't come online until 1983. But through the Rapid Deployment Force, which he supported at the Pentagon, the foundation was laid for addressing all of the factors that we have in the 21st century around the Islamists that continue through their terrorist activities to menace the West. So in this way, he is the foundation for the 21st century in terms of American grand strategy. And I've written about this in a book with Condoleezza Rice and the former Secretary of State. Professor Bruce Bueno de Mesquita at NYU, and Professor Sergio Cadelia. You can't talk about the Reagan presidency. You can't talk about the 21st century U.S. presidents without understanding the grave challenges that Jimmy Carter experienced during his time in the Oval Office.
You know, he's often referred to, particularly as in his later life in the many decades post-presidency, as a peacemaker, as someone that would reach out and try to bridge these divides. And during the course of his presidency, he had some success in brokering peace with Egypt and with Israel. But that seemed to be really a part of who he wanted to be as president, to be the diplomat, to bring people together and to seek those spaces for peace. Did he break ground in that essence?
Absolutely.
Making the U.S. presidency
Amen.
a little bit more about that.
Yes, the deal that he brokered at Camp David, known as the Camp David Accords, which for the first time led to a peace deal and normalization between Israel and one of its Arab neighbors, was an important moment for world history and set the predicate for the Abraham Accords, frankly. It led to not only normalization between Egypt and Israel, but also Israel's commitment to withdraw from the lands it captured in the 1967 Six-Day War. And that was due to Jimmy Carter. He wanted to do more of those kinds of negotiations, but he got overtaken by history. We've already talked about the Iranian Revolution and the hostages being taken in November 1979. That, 444 days of Americans being held hostage would hurt any presidency. But then the next month in December, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. A few months later in April, he attempts to free the hostages, and 8 American servicemen were killed in the desert in Iran trying to get there. So he had a lot of history hitting him. But the through line for Jimmy Carter was always to be the peace negotiator. He tried in every possible way, and he tried to combine it with strength. I don't know if anyone could have succeeded. Ronald Reagan said in 1976, after he lost the nomination to Gerald Ford, that had he won in 76, he would not have succeeded as president in the years ahead. This was a very difficult time.
Absolutely. Kyron Skinner, thank you so much for sharing it and beautifully sharing your history and your knowledge with us tonight. Thank you. Rich?
Thank you.
Molly, we're just getting word from the White House now that President Biden will deliver remarks on the passing of former President Jimmy Carter. That is scheduled to happen at the top of the hour, just about 19 minutes from now. In the meantime, we're going to go to Massachusetts Democratic Congressman Jake Auchincloss, who's here with us. Congressman, thank you for joining us this evening. As someone who is in national political office, what did President Carter's legacy mean to you?
Good evening, and thank you for having me on. President during a turbulent time for America, humanitarian after his presidency, really defining post-presidency tenures over the last 50 years. But most of all, to me, as the youngest parent in the Democratic caucus in Congress, I look at Jimmy Carter as a family man, someone whose devotion to his wife, to his children, to his grandchildren is an inspiration to me personally about understanding what truly matters in life and prioritizing it and holding it sacred.
Amen.
You look at some of the statements that have come across. There have been, Republicans, Democrats, people from leaders from across the world who have weighed in. I guess, this is a moment of bipartisanship to remember a former president who has passed. Is this something that you think can be lasting on Capitol Hill?
What can be lasting, I think, is what Hakeem Jeffries said about Jimmy Carter's legacy, which is that he embodied the maxim that faith without works is dead. And we must move our feet while we pray in elective office. We must make manifest our beliefs, our convictions, and be willing to put in the sweat, the blood, the tears to make possible the policies and the aspirations that we hold for the American people. This is what Jimmy Carter, I think, embodied. Disagree or agree with any single one of his positions or principles, he did the work for them.
Congressman, what do you think it says about resiliency here? He had a pretty bruising loss in 1980 and then went on to have probably the most prolific post-presidency in history.
I think he was grounded by his faith. I think that when someone holds faith as genuinely core to their identity as Jimmy Carter did, and who understood what mattered around him, his relationship with God, his family, being president wasn't the pinnacle of his life. It just wasn't the most important thing. It wasn't what defined him.
Being saved was the most important thing in his life.
Himself, when he lost that, he was able to continue with the works that were meaningful to him, and that kind of genuine public service, that kind of authenticity, I think, comes through crystal clear to the American people,
Absolutely.
especially these days.
Congressman Jake Auchincloss, thanks so much for your perspective this evening. We are still awaiting remarks from President Biden. He is scheduled to speak a little more than 15 minutes now as he is visiting and on vacation in St. Croix. We will be back with more on the death of former President Jimmy Carter.
Health, Nutrisystem has new high protein and low carb plans. Oh, and start losing weight for less than $5 a day. And check out our program.
We're also getting reaction from President-elect Donald Trump on the passing of President Jimmy Carter. We have Matt Finn. He is in West Palm Beach, Florida, with the latest on this. Matt, to you.
Hi, Molly. This past week, President-elect Trump and his team have been holding some high-profile meetings at Mar-a-Lago. Today, not too many movements from President-elect Trump. Our understanding is that he arrived at Trump International Golf Course around 9:30 this morning and departed around 3:30. He posted to Truth Social a few times today, including a recent post honoring the life of President Jimmy Carter. President-elect Trump posting online, quote, "I just heard the news about the passing of President Jimmy Carter. Those of us who have been fortunate to have served as president understand this is a very exclusive club, and only we can relate to the enormous responsibility of leading the greatest nation in history. The challenges Jimmy faced as president came at a pivotal time for our country, and he did everything in his power to improve the lives of all Americans. For that, we owe him a debt of gratitude. Melania and I are thinking warmly of the Carter family and their loved ones during this difficult time. We urge everyone to keep them in their hearts and their prayers." President-elect Trump's statement came shortly after President Biden's post online, and we understand that President Biden will be speaking momentarily. Stay tuned to Fox News for President Biden's update as well. Back to you, Molly.
Great point, Matt Finn. We're watching all of this as the reaction continues to come in from across the country and around the globe. Rich?
Well, Molly, we're now going to go to senior congressional correspondent Chad Pergram, who's on the phone with us. And Chad, there is an awful lot of planning ongoing right now, and what we expect will be President Carter's trip to the nation's capital and the Capitol Dome. What can you tell us?
Yeah, we usually expect this about 7 to 8 days after the day of death here. So President Carter, he will come and he will lie in state in the Capitol Rotunda, probably around January 6th, January 7th. I should note, Rich, that they have to approve some sort of a special resolution between the House and Senate, a concurrent resolution to allow him to lie in state. I should note that if there is a problem, say, electing a Speaker of the House, they can't do that because the House would not be functional on January 3rd. However, what happened back in late 2006 when President Ford died the day after Christmas that year, what they did was they had a letter from the Speaker of the House and the President pro tem of the Senate, and that was good enough to kind of authorize them to have President Ford lie in state, and you could also do that retroactively. There have been 34 persons who have lied in state in the Capitol Rotunda, 8 in honor. The last person to lie in state, that was Harry Reid, the Senate Majority Leader. That was in January of 2022. And you had George H.W. Bush, who was the last president to lie in state. That was in December of 18. We're starting to get also some congressional reaction here. Hakeem Jeffries, the Democratic leader, he complimented President Carter on his commitment to humanity. He said that this was his North Star for future generations of public service. House Speaker Mike Johnson said because of the work that President Carter did, brokering the Camp David Accords and advocating for Habitat for Humanity, the world is a more peaceful place, and Americans have, a place to call home now. Also a comment from John Thune. He is the incoming Senate Majority Leader here in just a couple of days. He says that President Carter dedicated his life to serving the people of Georgia, rising from a peanut farmer. Mitch McConnell, the outgoing Republican leader in the Senate, the minority leader right now, said that Jimmy Carter's character and commitment, just like his crops were the fruits of American soil. And what will probably happen, Rich, here, they will have a ceremony where he will probably lie in state for, a couple of days. This is usually what happens. The public will be allowed to come into the Capitol and circulate at regular intervals around the casket. And again, this comes at a very, different time here, a confluence of time, because you have to start the new Congress on January 3rd. They have to certify the Electoral College on January 6th. And then, of course, you have the inauguration on January 20th. And this, has nothing to do with legislating and everything else, but this is just one more factor that goes into all the different things that are happening on Capitol Hill from a security standpoint and so on. This is going to be a hectic time on Capitol Hill in the next week or two.
Now, Carter's election was also a bit of a turning point as well. He ushered in a period of governors getting elected president and stopping an era of members of Congress getting elected president, right?
Yeah, that was something that we saw after that. We saw Reagan, of course, who had been governor of California. We saw Bill Clinton. We saw George W. Bush, who, of course, had been governor of Texas. And that was something that we were starting to see more and more of. We had only ever elected 2 senators directly from the Senate to the presidency. So that was a bit of an anomaly. But you've had people who had served in other capacities before. And again, that was kind of a paradigmatic shift, as you say, talking about the South, kind of a different type of Democrat coming from the South. When he ran for governor, he was somebody who said, we need to, kind of get this racism out of the Democratic Party, be for civil rights. And that was a pivoting point. This was kind of the evolution of the Democratic Party in the South. And as he came into office, and again, and I said this to you a couple of hours ago, Rich, this period that Jimmy Carter, when he was in office, there was a lot of turbulence on the global stage. I referenced the comment from Mike Johnson talking about the accord that was signed between Israel and Egypt in March of '79. Well, some of those things have set the table for what we're dealing with today in the Middle East and beyond.
Senior congressional correspondent Chad Pergram with the perspective there. Chad, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, Molly, just an incredible 3 hours. We were supposed to do 1. We did 3 after the death of President Jimmy Carter, announced just a couple of hours ago here. A remarkable time, a political life, one that was much, much longer out of office than it was in office.
Yeah, a remarkable long political life, as you mentioned, but one also filled with faith and service and family, a prolific author, a poet, let's not forget, as well as a humanitarian and a peacemaker. This long and remarkable life, we heard from so many different voices that highlighted many of the points of his life, his work in civil rights and humanitarian efforts, and facing so many challenges over the course of his presidency as well.
Yeah, and certainly when you look abroad, the criticism that he had gotten of the rise of the Iranian regime under his term, but brokering a peace deal between Egypt and Israel, really the first of its kind, and a prelude to what would happen many decades later with Israel reaching peace agreements around the region with its neighbors, Molly.
He strived throughout the course of his presidency to be a great diplomat and went on throughout his life to work as a peacemaker, humanitarian, and a man of faith. An honor to remember him tonight, the former president, Jimmy Carter, dying at 100 years old.